Hello and welcome to The Take with Sophy Ridge, live at 9 here in the heart of Westminster. Well, the Prime Minister has been astride the global stage this week. He's heading home from the G20 in Bali now. But as he leaves the sunny skies behind, there's no shortage of dark clouds to welcome him home. Dominic Raab was standing in for his boss at PMQs today after calling for an inquiry into bullying allegations about himself. And we're just hours away from a budget in all but name that could define Rishi Sunak's premiership and the fate of his party too. We will bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes.
Now, after days of dodging and denial, this morning the Deputy Prime Minister finally acknowledged formal complaints about his misconduct. But his letter contains no hint of admission or apology.
It was the battle of the deputies at PMQs today. That was Angela Rayner attacking her opposite number over allegations of bullying.
I received notification this morning. I immediately asked the Prime Minister to set up an independent inquiry into them. I'm confident I behaved professionally throughout, but of course I will engage thoroughly.
Well, everything in the Commons today, though, was really just a prelude to the main event tomorrow when Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, will unveil a very significant budget in all but name. We're going to be asking our viewers what they're hoping for or perhaps dreading from that autumn statement. There they are. Looking forward to speaking to them, getting their takes later. We'll also have some top guests on the programme today, including Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride, what could be happening to his budget. Labour's Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson will be on the programme, plus the former Chancellor and Conservative grandee Lord Ken Clarke. We'll also be speaking to the former National Security Advisor Lord Peter Ricketts, plus much more besides on The Take. Hello, good evening. Well, there's usually nothing a Prime Minister likes more than getting out of the country and looking statesmanlike at the big global summits. And Rishi Sunak had plenty of that at the G20 this week. And of course, global relations were given a fresh urgency today thanks to a stray missile hitting Poland. But the PM is likely to be back to the UK with a bump, as the decisions in tomorrow's autumn statement will likely dominate for days, weeks, even years to come. So let's crack straight on. We're going to start with the best bits of the week so far.
The Home Secretary has now signed a long-awaited deal with France this morning aimed at tackling the growing migrant crisis.
I've been absolutely clear that illegal migration, particularly in the numbers that we've been seeing more recently, is totally unacceptable.
I'm confident that we can get the numbers down, but I also want to be honest with people that it isn't a single thing that will magically solve this. We can't do it overnight.
The leaders of the world's biggest economies gather in Bali this morning for the G20 meeting.
With Russia's foreign minister sitting there, we highlighted both the illegality and barbaric nature of Russia's war.
The coroner has ruled that a 2-year-old boy died as a result of a severe respiratory condition caused by prolonged exposure to mould in his home.
Stop housing people in homes you know are unfit for human habitation.
And all this whataboutery, all this, oh, if only we had more government money. Do your job, man.
NATO is facing its biggest decision of the Ukraine war tonight after what appeared to be Russian missiles hit a village in Poland, killing 2 people.
We have no indication that this was the result of a deliberate attack.
Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, says he's confident he behaved professionally after 2 formal complaints were made about his conduct.
This morning the Deputy Prime Minister finally acknowledged formal complaints about his misconduct. This is anti-bullying week. Will he apologise?
I immediately asked the Prime Minister to set up an independent inquiry into them. I'm confident I behaved professionally throughout.
Well, lots of things to focus on today on the programme, but it's right to start, I think, with tomorrow's autumn statement. We know there will be both tax rises and spending cuts, and a little earlier today I spoke to one person who's perhaps closer to what's going to happen the most, the Work and Pensions Secretary, former chair of the Treasury Select Committee and key ally of Rishi Sunak as well, Mel Stride. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Now, there's been an awful lot of pitch rolling about what to expect from the autumn statement, eye-watering. Difficult decisions, according to the Chancellor. Yeah. Do we need to brace ourselves?
I think it's going to be quite tough because what we do know very clearly is we've got very high inflation,
very tight labour market. We're going to be have the prospect of pretty low growth for some time, in common with other economies around the world. The IMF is saying about a third of world economies will go into recession in the next year. And that's the backdrop with this huge fiscal hole that needs to be filled. So what we know from that is there are going to be some very tough decisions he's going to have to take on tax and on spending. What we don't know is what exactly they're going to look like, but there is a £50+ billion fiscal hole to fill, and that means some big decisions, I think.
Are we all going to be paying more tax?
Well, the Chancellor, I think, has said that. Whether it's absolutely everybody, down to every last member of the public that pays more tax or not, let's wait to see. But I think the point that he's making there is that the size of that fiscal hole is such that you're going to probably have to look at tax measures that are fairly broadly based if you're going to bring in the amounts of money that's required.
There's also, of course, talk about cuts to public services, and that's going to be alarming for a lot of people who will be looking at the state of their public services and thinking, where is the fat to be trimmed here? Schools, for example, where they've got, talking about cutting teaching assistants or cutting back on textbooks at a time when inflation is already at 11%.
Yes. That's part of what's going to be really difficult. Now, one of the first decisions he's going to have to take is what's the balance between tax rises and expenditure cuts. And we don't know that yet. But the more he leans into tax, of course, the less he'll have to lean into controlling expenditure. Well, you're absolutely right. With inflation as it is at the moment, given that most spending settlements were struck some time ago when expectations of inflation were much lower, there are going to be those additional pressures on the public finances. But let's see what he has to say about that. Bear in mind, of course, the pain here will probably be spread over several years, maybe 5 years, before we reach the critical point where his fiscal target kicks in, which I think will probably be 2027, 28. And it's in that year that he has to get all these sums to add up. He doesn't necessarily have to go for lots of short-term pain. He could spread it.
You see, this is where my slight scepticism kicks in, I'll be honest. Because obviously there will be some things that come in earlier. Are some of these cuts and spending squeezes a bit of a fantasy, designed to reassure the markets in the short term, but in the long term, particularly the ones that, as you say, are post the next election, they're not going to happen, are they?
Well, I think the critical phrase you've just used there, Sophie, is reassure the markets. That's the litmus test. So the markets will have a very good nose for this. They will look at the plans that are put forward and they will say, perhaps, I don't think it will happen, but maybe they might say, there's too much pain tomorrow. He's getting too easy a ride. He's pushing it all to the back beyond the next general election. It doesn't feel credible. I don't think he'll make that mistake. So I think there will be a fairly balanced budget in terms of what tax and spending are doing in the short and medium term, as well as further down the line. I
want to talk to you a bit about your department, Work and Pensions, a big spending department, of course. Now, Jeremy Hunt told me at the weekend we've got a big increase in the number of people who aren't working, who aren't taking part in work, even though they perhaps could. Is he right?
Yes, he's absolutely right. Now, as it happens, compared to other major economies, they are in a very similar position. In fact, we're in no worse a position than most other economies. But nonetheless, there are 9 million people who are economically inactive. And they fall into 4 basic groups. One is students, then you've got those that have retired early, you've got those that are long-term sick, and you've got those that are caring, have caring responsibilities. Now, each one of those cohorts has different levers, if you like, that you can try and pull to encourage and support them into work. And what the Prime Minister has asked me to do is to look at that as a main project now for the DWP, is how do we really get across all those cohorts and do whatever we can to make sure we increase the uptake of those going into the workplace, particularly as that number's grown a lot during the pandemic. An extra 600,000 went into economic inactivity over the period of the pandemic.
So what levers are you going to pull then to try and encourage, if you like, these people back into work, to put the kindest gloss on it?
Yes, so it depends on the group that you're looking at. So, for example, if they are already engaged with the Department for Work and Pensions, they're on benefits, one would look at, for example, what kind of support are we providing people to get into work? How frequent is the contact we have for those, for example, that are on universal credit? How many hours do we expect people to work before we take a lighter touch approach to that? Do we extend the number of hours we expect people to be in work before we say, right, OK, we can leave you that support, withdraw that support a little bit. So I think there are issues around conditionality and benefits. If you've retired, however, early, say age 55, and you're feeling comfortable and you're not claiming any benefits at all, then you're kind of beyond our boundary. But nonetheless, there might be things that government more generally can do to encourage those people back into work. Flexible working offers, for example, making sure that those individuals are really clear as to what the costs of their retirement are going to be, because they're working on this assumption that, you know, taking it easy at 55 is going to still work out by the time you reach 65. So there are all sorts of different interventions, but what I'm going to do is look at each one of those cohorts in detail and do the really hard research, kicking of the tyres to make sure we come up with the best possible policy.
So you're quite open, saying that you are going to be trying to effectively push some people on benefits back into work. They should be working more in
when the Prime Minister appointed me in the Cabinet room, he discussed the various things he wanted me to do, and top of that list was economic, you know, those that are disengaged.
I mean, some will be saying that it sounds, you know, could be seen as a bit heartless. If, you know, a lot of people that particularly on, you know, long-term sick, who are on caring, as you say, or are on benefits, struggling, trying to make things work with inflation, they'll be looking at what you're saying and thinking, hang on a minute, he's talking about taking my money away from me and I cannot work.
This is, I'm not talking about taking people's money away, and certainly not for very good reason. I mean, if people don't engage and expect to be supported and not do anything to look for work, then that's a particular scenario. But most people are far from that particular situation. But I think it is true that there are some within those various groups that we can help if we come up with the right policies to do that, and that's what I think we should do. And we know that of that 9 million, 1.7 million are saying that they want to work. So not everybody, there will some long-term people with long-term illnesses where it just won't be appropriate and it won't work, and I accept that. But there are millions, there are some millions for whom work is actually going to be quite appealing if we just make it happen.
Now, it looks from reporting as though the pensions triple lock may be protected. You know, the government's talked a lot about people with the broadest shoulders bearing some of the burden. We're expecting to see a squeeze in pay, if you like, for public sector workers. Is it fair that for a retiree, many of whom are wealthy, although except, of course, there is pension poverty, that they might see their pensions go up by 10% along with inflation, when public sector workers could only dream of that kind of rise?
OK, well, the first thing is I can't confirm or deny whether the triple lock will stay. Unfortunately, we'll have to wait until tomorrow what the Chancellor has to say. But in terms of that 10%, of course, the uprating that occurred last time round, which was in April of last year, pegged on the previous September's inflation rate, was just 3.1%. So and inflation was running higher over most of the period after that. So there's an element of swings and roundabouts. But I think the critical thing about pensioners is that, unlike most of the rest of us, they're at a time of life where re-engaging with the workforce is much more problematic and difficult, and therefore it's much harder for them to adjust their own economic situation.
For public sector workers or for everyone else too as well.
That's
it's not
why,
easy.
Sophie,
if someone could click their fingers and get a pay rise, we'd all be at it.
Indeed. So that's why the government has come forward with all these interventions, like, for example, my department has been sending 8 million households £650. Now, they are households typically on UC. They're the lowest income households in the country, and then there's £150 for those with disabilities, £300 for pensioners again, and help with council tax for those on the lower council tax band. So there's lots of targeted support that's going into looking after just the people that you're referring to.
OK. I want to talk to you about Dominic Raab. He, of course, is facing an investigation into allegations of bullying behaviour. Is it correct that Rishi Sunak will be the ultimate arbiter of that investigation and all the findings will be passed to him to make a judgment?
Well, my understanding, and I think Dominic has done exactly the right thing, there have been a couple of instances of complaints that have come forward. He's gone to the Prime Minister. He's recommended to the Prime Minister that he looks into this. The PM has agreed. When Lord Geidt is replaced, then there will be somebody to look into that. And I have no doubt that that individual, whoever it is, will do so without fear and favour. So
Lord Geidt, of course, the ethics advisor sacked by Boris Johnson.
Well,
quite useful to have around,
the Prime Minister has made it very clear that integrity and transparency and good governance is absolutely core to this government's mission. So I have no doubt whoever replaces Lord Geidt conducts this investigation will do so without fear, favour or indeed interference. So I'm absolutely confident that it will be an independent exercise.
Just finally, I want to talk a little bit about the wider culture in Westminster. So, going to park the allegations about Dominic Raab for now. Our reporters Liz Bates and Aggie Chambre have been investigating bullying in Westminster for a podcast, Open Secret. All parties, not just the Conservatives. And I just want to read to you some of the anonymous quotes given to them. She was always asking me, the MP from a staffer, she was always asking me to do things that were inappropriate. She got me to scrub stains out of the carpet. Another one. I remember feeling like a dog in an RSPCA advert where they hide behind the sofa when the owners are coming back. And finally, I knew she had a terrible reputation. Some other MPs approached me after I left and said, oh, my God, how did you last that long?
Right. Well, clearly, we don't know the specifics of all those cases that you've raised, but they sound pretty horrific. And they're unacceptable. And that's why I think the House of Commons, as a general sort of umbrella to all the MPs as employers, has come a long way, actually, with its grievance procedures, and people are encouraged to come forward now. So I think that's the way forward. But it's very sad when you hear those things. I totally agree. I can only speak from my own experience, mixing and mingling with members of Parliament. And, OK, I don't spend a lot of time down in the bars, as it happens, and perhaps that's where all the bad behaviour goes on. But I've found, generally speaking, that colleagues are serious people who want to do the best for their constituency, and I say that right across the House, all parties, and generally treat their staff with great respect. But where there are exceptions, it needs to be dealt with, and I think the processes are now there for that to happen.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was the Work and Pensions Secretary, Mel Stride, perhaps giving us a bit of a flavour on what to expect from his department, at least tomorrow. Well, let's turn to Labour now, shall we, and the party's Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson. Big day tomorrow, autumn statement. What are you going to be looking out for?
The key for us is to look at whether the government are making fair choices where it comes to taxation in particular. So we'll be doing things differently, whether it's ending that non-dom tax status, charging VAT on private schools, putting that money into state education. There's a lot of areas, really, that the government have got some straightforward choices, I think, around fairness, but also on growth. You know, we've had terrible growth these last 12 years as a country. Obviously, we're facing particularly acute pressures at the moment on the cost of living because the Conservatives crashed the economy, and the fact we're having tomorrow is as a result of that failure. But this isn't just a more recent problem. We've had a terrible record as a country on growth, and Labour's Green Prosperity Plan is about delivering that growth with high-paid, good jobs, secure jobs in every corner of our country.
You say that it's because the Conservatives crashed the economy. It's a bit more complicated than that, though, isn't it? We're obviously not, completely negating the impact of the mini-budget, but we are seeing a global inflation crisis. We're seeing a war in Ukraine. We're seeing what happened with Putin as well.
They crashed the economy and they've mismanaged it for 12 years. So if you've been in charge for 12 years, you've had a long time to make choices about the direction of our country. I mean, undeniably, there are global factors. Of course, every country is confronted with some of this, but that doesn't explain why we're bottom of the pile where it comes to growth. We're uniquely exposed as a country going into this crisis, the fact that we are so dependent. Our energy security, we don't have that independence of supply, and part of Labour's plan is about making sure that in future we're not so exposed to those kinds of global fluctuations. But this is squarely on them. The fact that people are going to be paying more on their mortgages every month is because of the decisions of the Conservative Party.
Jeremy Hunt's been pretty upfront that there is going to be a public spending squeeze as well. There's been strong hints that the NHS is going to be protected, that the pensions triple lock is going to be protected, that benefits will be rising in line with inflation. Are you a bit worried about what that means for education, your department?
I'm incredibly worried about the pressure that our schools are under at the moment. And when I speak to heads, when I speak to teachers and support staff, they are doing amazing work, working so hard. But the challenges and the pressure, they see it every day with children arriving at school who haven't had that good start that they need, where their families are struggling to give them the best. That's why Labour would deliver breakfast clubs for every primary school child, so they get a good start to the day. But the pressures that schools are under, having to make decisions about whether they're going to have to lose staff or whether they can afford to give children the basics. I think one really straightforward way that the government could fill some of that would be to end the tax benefits that private schools enjoy. And
how much
tomorrow,
money does that raise, though?
That raises £1.7 billion.
It's not going to really touch the science, is it?
I think it would make a big difference. You look at the number of teachers that you could recruit, 6,500 new teachers, better mental health support in our schools, careers guidance for all of our children. It gets you a lot. And I don't think you can go around saying that you've got choices to make and not consider the really straightforward, easy choices. There is no justification for that kind of taxpayer subsidy of private schools. And it's the opportunity for the Chancellor on Thursday to end that and to put that money into the schools that support the vast majority of our children.
You've talked about the pressures that we're under, whether it's inflation, but also, of course, borrowing and borrowing costs. Are there any areas of public spending where you think, actually, yes, this is where we could look at finding spend savings?
I think it's quite tough. I mean, there has been a big squeeze over the last 12 years. I mean, we do believe that you need to make sure you're getting value for money. That's why we've said that Labour would set up the Office of Value for Money to make sure that we're getting real value from every pound.
Are there any areas where you think that, look, maybe this, if we have to make difficult choices, this is the department where maybe they could fall?
There will, no government is perfect in how it spends its money. And of course, you should be looking at getting the best out of the money that you're spending. But I don't think, if I look, for example, across education, it's not that they are awash with money and have got more money than they know what to do with. I mean, unlike the oil and gas companies who haven't actually been taxed for what they have been enjoying at the moment. So I think all of this comes down to choices for government, both in terms of priorities, but also tax fairness. You can't just...
That is the key, though, isn't it? The choices for government, which I guess is why I'm asking, if there is any areas where you think savings could be found.
Well, I'd always be open to looking for it, but I think given the pressures that our public sector has been under these last 12 years, whether it's our schools or hospitals, an awful lot has been cut back, and cut back to such a point that, for example, with schools, they're the last line of defence, really, for so many of our communities. That wider infrastructure, that wider support that families need, that's gone. Okay. And so much of it falls to schools. So actually, if you had to free up, if you had to get high standards and excellence in all of our schools, you could deliver that far more effectively if you had that wider support available to all families, so that it doesn't always just fall to our teachers and school leaders.
I want to ask you about Dominic Raab, who obviously is facing allegations of bullying, and there's going to be an independent investigation into his conduct. He says he welcomes it, he'll comply. Are you satisfied with that?
Well, we don't know who as yet is to lead this independent inquiry. Of course, the Prime Minister hasn't appointed his independent ethics advisor. He promised us a government that would be rooted in integrity, professionalism and accountability. This falls a long way short, but it's not just about Dominic Raab. You look at Suella Braverman back in the Cabinet, having breached the ministerial code on an issue of national security, Gavin Williamson put back into government. I think this speaks to a deeper question as to Rishi Sunak's character and also his weakness, that he feels so weak within his own party, that he is doing what he feels is right by his party. It should be about what's right for the country. That isn't what's happening right now.
I just wonder if you think it also speaks to a deeper problem in Westminster and trying to sort of take the kind of party politics out of this. Sky News has a podcast where two of our reporters have been looking into allegations of bullying, the Open Secret podcast, and they found examples across all parties. One staffer telling them, I'm sure every staffer in Parliament has got a story, even if they weren't bullied, they know someone who was. I mean, is there a problem with bullying and the treatment of staff in Westminster?
I think you get real problems where you have an imbalance of power and where people don't feel able to make complaints. And that, for too long, has been the case in Westminster. And, we do have a process now, and I hope that people will come forward where they have been on the end of poor treatment in the workplace, because no matter where you work, you should be treated with respect and you shouldn't be subjected to bullying. And the same is true, of course, right across government as well. And sometimes people don't feel comfortable coming forward. They want to try and just plough on and do their best, but no one should feel under that kind of pressure. And I think you do see what happens when you have a more open culture where people do feel that they can come forward. And we've got more work to do in Westminster, absolutely. But I think it does come down to that dynamic around the imbalance of power. And, we all of us as politicians have a responsibility to make sure that, we are respectful of others. Politics can involve, robust exchange, that's as it should be, but you don't cross that line.
Thank you very much for being on the programme.
Thank you.
Bridget Phillipson there from Labour. Now, a little later, we're going to be talking to the former Conservative Chancellor, Ken Clarke. Looking forward to that one. But just first, we can get the first take from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Sam, there's been an awful lot of pitch rolling, a lot of talk about difficult decisions. Is it all going to be doom and gloom tomorrow, do you think?
You're right, Sophie. For weeks, there's been absolutely clear doom and gloom from the Chancellor, from the Prime Minister. We're expecting somewhere in the order of £20 billion, a bit more, of tax rises, £30 billion of spending cuts. And this is all tough stuff. Income tax rises, council tax rises, public spending reductions way to the second half of this decade. So the question really is if they're going to suck up that pain. What's the glue? What's the good news to bind this all together? Two things I understand tonight. First of all, Rishi Sunak has made schools a priority. I understand that actually he's going to put his money where his mouth is. There's going to be some protection for the schools' budgets in the years to come tomorrow. And secondly, energy bills. Now, Jeremy Hunt had been expected to junk the Liz Truss plan to protect people from those spiralling bills. He's actually going to keep a version of Liz Truss's plan at a less generous level, it has to be said. But nevertheless, that's quite a big U-turn for him to suck up. This might be Jeremy Hunt's budget. It's Rishi Sunak's big moment, however. It'll be him that this is all judged on.
Really interesting stuff. So schools and energy, two things to look out for tomorrow. Thank you, Sam. And now, as Sam was saying, the Chancellor says he's going to be making eye-wateringly difficult decisions tomorrow. On our Sunday programme, he told me that everyone is going to be paying a bit more tax. We can talk now to someone who might know a little more than most what is going through the Chancellor's mind as he prepares for the autumn statement, the former Chancellor Ken Clarke. Thank you so much for being on the programme today.
Pleasure, although I'm a very out-of-date Chancellor. You know, a lot's changed since I was Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes, certainly. What do you think Jeremy Hunt's going to be feeling then?
Well, I think he's been feeling he's gotten on a terrible task, really difficult problems. But he's not the first Chancellor to have taken over the consequences of a financial crisis or facing a recession and all the rest of it. But no, he's something, I bet he rethinks. He's not taken on an ideal, easy time. So he's got to get it right tomorrow. And getting it right doesn't mean getting good write-ups in the newspapers the day afterwards. He will be judged by whether in a couple of years' time it appears to have worked. The only hope for the government is that in a couple of years' time, after we go through a very hard winter, very hard for some people, if the economy then seems to be picking up and we're coming out of the troubles and so on. But tomorrow, he's got to do necessary, tough, difficult things, which is what half of government's about all the time anyway. And ignore the fact that it'll be hated by large amounts of the public. Just get on and do it, and so you can turn around in 2 years' time, say, I told you so, we had to do it.
It feels like the Conservative Party is slightly split into two camps. You know, the camp that think, look...
Oh, at least more than two
probably
camps.
more, yes. One camp thinking that difficult decisions have to be made, the markets have to be satisfied, spending cuts, tax rises. The other camp saying, hang on a minute, it looks like we're already in a recession. That's probably the worst thing that you could do right now. Where do you fall?
Well, he does have to raise taxes and cut public spending. I mean, in bold terms. And it is going to be unpopular. And there's a section of the Conservative Party that will go ape because it'll get a bad write-up, probably, in the press. And most of their constituents, realising we're in a recession and they're going to be worse off, living standards of the majority of people are going to fall over the next year or two. I'm not sure the bank are right that it's only going to be a shallow recession if we're not careful. They'll just want to say, well, my constituents want the government to give them some more money and spend some more money on the public services they like and cut their taxes. You know, they're feeling hard up. That's childlike. He's got to make the case. They have tried to make the case already. I do think Rishi and his Chancellor, Jeremy, have gone around and been preparing the ground. They've been quite open that it's going to be tough. Now, of course, there's no getting away from the fact when he comes up with the reality, there'll be howls of rage. And he can't be non-political. He's got to discuss extremely carefully how they're going to get it through the House of Commons. But there are some pretty wild right-wing people and populist people in the House of Commons at the moment. Most of them are not quite so mad as to drive the government into an election at the moment, which would cost a very large number of them their seats if they brought the government down, which opposing a budget usually does.
Interesting. You mentioned there an election. You know, some people will be looking at the economic situation, which is obviously in a bad place, and thinking the Conservatives have had 12 years in power. Surely it's time for a change.
Well, they can't escape the fact we've had 12 years in power, but we started in an impossible situation. Everybody now dismisses George Osborne and says, oh, he made a mistake with austerity and so on. We took over after the most appalling financial crash and crisis. The economy was about to collapse, and we got us through that. What we never did was get us really back to the healthy growth with low inflation, which we'd enjoyed in the 90s when we first took the benefit of Margaret's reforms, and we had the great normality of the 1990s when, again, we had crashes then. I took over after Black Wednesday, but we got through to growth with low inflation. And I think we did a good job at first. We kept austerity going for too long, and then we've been hit by all these hammer blows. It's a global problem. Brexit, which is self-inflicted, which is why we're doing worse than any other G7 country, because we inflicted on ourselves just a huge blow to our own trade. But we did have the pandemic, and we have the effects of the war in Ukraine.
And you'll acknowledge
and
the
global
Liz Truss government also.
Well, that would put the tin lid on things. A rather comic episode when Liz and Kwasi, unfortunately, came up with this childishly simplistic stuff, which was terribly popular. You know, the Daily Mail's headline was, "At last, a real Tory budget." And what was that? It was cutting taxes for the older, better off middle classes and cutting the value of benefits for the poor.
Although you did say back in August during the leadership that both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak were offering, pursuing the votes of the older, prosperous middle class population, and so they were all guilty of trying to cheer up better off pensioners.
Well, Rishi, in the course of that ludicrous contest, when we inflicted on ourselves and on the country 4 weeks of really nauseating, sort of stupid hustings all over the country, with the media demanding they came up with a new policy off the cuff every day, Rishi did say some silly things himself. He was drawn into them. He did warn about the basic disaster of doing what Liz and Kwasi promptly did. But if you remember, he was slipped into giving all sorts of promises, which I think he now says he's reviewing them all.
Yes, he is.
And he won't actually implement any of them until the economic circumstances allow. But he was promising income tax cuts next year and, putting up pensions, all kinds of things as well. So I think my comment then was justified. It was a time when I've never known British politics reduced to such ludicrous, low-level, knockabout nonsense as it was during the campaign, with Rishi's warning about fiscal responsibility being the one redeeming virtue he had, made me support him, quite firmly.
Now, the Chancellor, traditionally allowed to consume alcohol when making a fiscal statement.
Yes.
I think we've got a great photo of
I was the last
here.
one that did.
This is you. I think you were drinking whiskey, were you, at that point?
I always had whiskey, yes. Glenforclas, I think it was, blended whiskey, because I visited the distillery. So I always got my PPS to lay on a very stiff glass of whiskey. I don't think she really knew the strength of whiskey, so I had a pretty good one.
And would you recommend it to Jeremy Hunt?
I mean, I had some tough budgets. My first budget, I raised the tax burden on the country by a bigger percentage than any chancellor since the war. But so I did a little political presentation and flourished the whiskey and ad-libbed a little around the serious bits of my speech and all the rest of it. And I don't think people noticed that I was raising the tax burden quite as I was. But every chancellor since Gladstone, I think, had done that. And I was succeeded by a Scotsman who stopped it. And Gordon wouldn't have the whiskey. And so this long-standing tradition, I mean, it was the only speech of the year that any member could take alcohol into the chamber, was the Chancellor delivering a budget. Gladstone took it in order to keep himself going for an hour or a few hours whilst he went ad-libbing through his great long budget. I did it. I didn't quite like drinking a sip of whiskey anyway. It gives you a bit more enthusiasm. And I did it again. I did deliberately use it a little theatrically. And then it was cancelled. No one's had the nerve to take it up again. So Jeremy's a very steady, sober sort of fellow, but you never know, he might revive it tomorrow. I hope that speaker wouldn't stop him if he did.
I love that. Fingers crossed, hey?
Fingers crossed.
Ken Clarke, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you this evening. Thank you.
Pleasure.
You're watching The Take. We are live in Westminster. Up next, we'll be talking to our viewers panel. Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You are watching The Take. Time now to find out what our viewers panel make of what is going to happen tomorrow. It's always good to try and get a bit of a sense of how people are feeling, what they'd like the government to focus on. We can talk to Hannah first. Hannah Walker, Labour voter from Dorset. Thanks for being on the programme, Hannah. Hannah, what are you hoping to see tomorrow?
Well, I think one of the things that bothers me is that the previous PM effectively took out a credit card in our name without our permission and racked up 40 billion quid's worth of debt on it at very high interest rates. And nobody gave her permission to do that. That was public money to be used for public services, and nobody had a right to spaff it away in a reckless gamble. So when grave-faced ministers tell us that they have to make very difficult decisions and eye-watering cuts, what they're really telling us is that we have to pay a second time for the money we've already paid, essentially to get half the amount of services, and just changing the front man doesn't make any difference at all to the fact that we are significantly worse off. And one of the reasons for this large black hole is because a PM only a few weeks ago threw away a lot of our public money that we have paid.
Certainly, as you say, the strong feelings of people about what happened previously under the last Conservative administration. Let's bring in Andy Flang now, shall we, from Suffolk. Andy, you're a social worker, I think. What would you like to see tomorrow?
I am. Well, I just kind of see how we keep on having these bust and boom. It's a bit like a kind of poor Star Trek, really, where spatial anomalies open up as a debt crisis and then appear to close magically, and there's no strategic planning. And right at the moment, the poorest are going to suffer the most. They're the ones who are actually going to be not being able to kind of put the heating on. If you're living in really poor accommodation, we've seen the really tragic case recently of the child who died from the spores in their home. And so you really got to wonder what we'll be doing, because also if you don't actually look after the most vulnerable, they will go onto the NHS waiting list, and that is a concern. So what you save, you spend later.
Really glad you spoke about the case of that poor little boy. It's a really shocking story this week. Right, let's talk to Pradeep now, shall we? Pradeep Sakataran, who is talking to us from Cumbria. Are there any particular areas that you'd like to see protected?
I certainly want to see the health and defence kind of departments not getting cut. I think with the current climate, we need the money in those departments. And I also want to see transparent, clear speech from the Chancellor. No jargon, no stealth taxes, no ability to change our council's taxes through referendums or so forth. And I want to see how growth is possible. We're all talking about tax rises and cuts. How do you grow the economy? How do you empower small and medium-term businesses to grow? And how do you actually windfall tax the larger corporations? So clear data and evidence-based kind of points will be good.
Okay. Right, let's bring in Rob now, shall we? Rob Tyler talking to us from Bolton, Conservative voter. Rob, what are you hoping to see tomorrow? Rob, can you hear me okay, Rob? I'm not sure Rob can hear us, unfortunately. OK, let's go to Tim in box 6 instead. I'm just repeating what I'm hearing in my ear there. Box 6 means nothing to you guys. Let's talk to Tim, who's talking to us from Dorset. Tim, what do you want to see tomorrow?
I want to see a decent budget, but I really don't know what's going to happen. But what we've seen and witnessed over recent years are a number of Conservative administrations which have floundered. And part of the reason they've floundered is because they've been populated with ideologically driven individuals who've just got no empathy. They don't care about people. Priti Patel and her bullying, Suella Braverman dreaming of seeing plane loads of people taking off to Rwanda for an uncertain future. We've got kamikaze Kwarteng damaging, crashing the economy. And now and Gavin Williamson and his text messages. And now we've got the allegations being made against Dominic Raab. There is no place in our government for people like that.
Right, let's bring in Izar, shall we? Izar Bhattacharjee next. Izar, are there any areas that you're hoping are protected when it comes to spending cuts? OK, Izar, can you hear me? It's Sophie. Just asking what you're hoping to hear from...
I think you're breaking up, Sophie.
Are we breaking up a bit? Yeah. Give us your thoughts anyway. No, we've lost Izar. It's going very well today. Never mind. Can we try Rob again? Rob, can you hear us again, Rob? No, we're going to move on. We're going to move on. Well, I think we did get a flavour, certainly, from our panel this evening about some of the anxiety, I guess, around what is going to be announced tomorrow. Let's talk to Sam, shall we, our Deputy Political Editor, who is here. So we're going to have no technical problem speaking to you, which is always a relief. Sam, what are we expecting?
So we have heard for weeks about how gloomy it is, how bad the situation, how much heavy lifting, tax cuts and spending tax rises and spending cuts are going to have to do when Jeremy Hunt stands up. We think it's about 11:30, 12 o'clock tomorrow in the House of Commons that he'll deliver his first autumn statement. He is, of course, the fourth Chancellor this year, delivering the third big economic statement, so we're hardly unfamiliar with the ritual that we'll see. But it's going to be difficult because effectively the path that this man and Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is going to take us on is completely different from the one 2 months ago pioneered by Liz Truss. Now, she was all about, whatever she said, she was all about more borrowing to do more spending. And these two want to put us on a very different path. And in effect, I think tomorrow will be a bit like the sort of memorial service for Trussonomics. But the question is, can you get all the Tory MPs singing from the same hymn sheet, given that all the things that they said that they believed over the summer, lower taxes and the like, all of that's going to be junked in favour of essentially prudence, trying to fill what these guys say is a £55 billion black hole. What's interesting, Sophie, to me, is that essentially just a month ago, we got rid of a Prime Minister, Liz Truss, because everybody thought she went too far with her additional borrowing. And really the conversation amongst some Tory MPs is not as many as with Truss, is whether or not Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt are about to make the same mistake. They're going to go too far, but in the other direction. Too much spending cuts, too many tax rises. Is it palatable for the public? Is it palatable for the Tory party? Really
Interesting to see the Conservative Party, of course, so fractured. We've got a bit of a sense about that with Ken Clarke, I think, as well. I've got to ask the question. I asked you this question on Sunday. I've got to ask it again. Do you think that all of this pain is going to happen? Mel Stride's saying some of these cuts aren't going to be he doesn't have to balance the books till 2027, 2028, he said.
Well, Mel Stride effectively agreed with the banana analysis that if all of this happens, I'm a banana. He made it clear that a lot of the pain was later in the Parliament, perhaps after an election, after you've had to promise something else. The job of tomorrow is convincing the markets that you're serious, providing the plan is robust enough. Who cares what happens in 2026, 2027?
Really interesting to talk, as always. Sam Coates there. You are watching The Take. We're live in Westminster on a big evening because up next we're going to be focusing on the situation in Ukraine. We're going to be speaking to the former National Security Advisor, Lord Ricketts.
I'm Becky Johnson, a Sky News correspondent, part of the team based here in the Midlands. Allegations of exploitation in Leicester's clothing factories aren't new. In fact, it's been an open secret in this city for years. Made for people who want clarity in an uncertain world.
We're getting more and more stabbings, and essentially I think it's more and more younger children. As a team, we're not really surprised by anything these days.
So there's reports of a male who's been stabbed repeatedly in the leg.
Here in the diverse industrial heart of England, we hear from people who have real stories to tell.
Parents are going to complain like this, and schools had better get ready for it.
These protests are being organised primarily by people who aren't parents at the school.
So some patients aren't going to survive this.
We have to be prepared that patients will die from this illness.
Staff here are currently identifying wards that could be turned into areas where patients with COVID-19 could be isolated. The River Severn is still rising, and people here in Ironbridge have been told it could go up by another metre before it starts to go back down.
It's going to be a long, slow process of putting it back together again.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
Hello, welcome back live to Westminster. You're watching The Take. Well, we can turn now to the other really significant story of the day. And NATO says that it thinks a missile that landed in Poland, killing 2 people, is likely to be from Ukrainian air defences. Now, that view has been disputed by Ukraine, but following a huge barrage of attacks across Ukraine, it, of course, has further ratcheted up the tensions between the West and Russia, with talk of invoking Article 4 of the NATO treaty. Well, we can speak now to Lord Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor and Foreign Office Permanent Secretary. Thank you so much for being with us. NATO say the missile is likely Ukrainian. Ukraine are disputing that. What is your sense?
Well, I think the most important point is that this incident only happened because Ukraine had been under this massive bombardment by the Russians against their civilian infrastructure. So that, I think, is the most important thing that was happening yesterday. Whoever fired this missile, it was only because of that. If it was a Ukrainian missile, which looks more and more likely, it was because they were firing in self-defense against this incoming barrage of Russian missiles. So I'm sure the experts will tell us pretty quickly, one way or the other, whose missile it was. But the bigger background is that this is one of the dangers, one of the things that happens when Russia behaves like this, going to war with a neighbouring country.
Of course, Poland is a member of NATO. Is this the kind of thing that could trigger a NATO response?
It's worth just remembering what Article 4 and Article 5 are about. Article 4 of the NATO treaty is consultations. That's effectively what's been happening today. The NATO Council met, they pooled information, they expressed solidarity with Poland, and they said they'd keep in close touch with events. Article 5, I mean, if a member state feels it's under an armed attack, and that's the criterion, an armed attack, then NATO members have agreed to act collectively. But the NATO treaty, it's a political treaty. It's not a legal commitment. And each nation is free to decide what kind of support it can give. So it doesn't put you on an escalator to, inevitable military conflict, but it is a collective defense vehicle. Now, if this was an errant Russian missile that went astray and hit Poland. That's hardly a deliberate armed attack on Poland. It would be a very different thing if the Russians made a deliberate attack on a Polish military installation. Then we really would be into issue of how NATO would respond militarily.
It's interesting, isn't it? Do you feel that because of the alliance and the consequences that could have, that Russia is, I guess, holding back slightly when it comes to other countries other than Ukraine?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think Putin, he's megalomaniac about Ukraine, but he understands the power of NATO and this power of deterrence, that if he does deliberately attack a NATO state, there will be an armed response from NATO. I think there's no doubt about that. And he's got no doubt about that. Ukraine, of course, is not a member state of NATO. It's a close partner. It's being supported by NATO, but it doesn't benefit yet from that collective guarantee, which effectively says you attack a member of NATO and NATO will come back at you very hard. That has worked so far. That red line has been respected by the Russians, assuming that this was not a deliberate attack by Russia on Poland, which I really don't think it was.
I was reflecting a bit earlier today about, the war in Ukraine, about all the appalling images that we've seen, about all the discussions, that we've had and the kind of international discussions as well. And just thinking how I just cannot really see a way out of it, frankly, right now. Is there any path that you can see for an end to the war?
Well, I think you're right. I hear talk about people saying there's got to be a negotiated solution, there's got to be a peace settlement here. I mean, I don't think that after all they've been through, the Ukrainians are about to do a deal with Russia, which leaves Russia in possession of some of their territory. Nor do I think Putin is about to do a complete unconditional withdrawal for all his troops. So I'm afraid what this is going to head up to is a stalemate over the winter, where more or less in the position the forces are now, and then probably more fighting next year. I guess in the end, some sort of armistice or truce, a bit like we've had in Korea for the last 70 years, where there is a line of separation, which is overseen by international peacekeeping forces, but neither side have accepted that they've won or lost, and there is no durable peace. That's the most likely outcome I can see from this. It's not a good one for Europe or for Ukraine, but it's certainly better for Ukraine, than if the Russians had succeeded in their original objective.
Yeah, some difficult analysis to hear, but I do, accept the kind of, I guess, accuracy of what you're saying. Lord Rick, it's always good to talk. Thank you very much for being on the programme. Well, that is it for The Take. We'll be back next week, every week, of course, on Wednesday at 9 p.m. You can also join us at Sky News for all of our coverage of the Autumn Statement. Tomorrow I'll be guiding you through that from the morning, so do hope you tune in for that. Next up, it's Sky News at